Thanks so much for joining me today. My name is Carter, and I want to introduce you to Paranormal Nation. If you are like me, you can't get enough scary and spooky stories. Ever since we were young, myself and my brother Chris love scary stories. They have always been a way for us to escape for a little while. In the past 5 years or so, we have created numerous stories that we hope you enjoy. This story that you are about to listen to is one of my original creations. Without further ado, let's get spooky. There has always been tales of giants that once roamed the earth. Even as far back as biblical times, the story of David and Goliath told a tale of impossible odds of David defeating Goliath and his giant status. Ever since I read the story, I have been intrigued and curious if there were other giants that lived here among us. My curiosity has led me to investigate tales and legends that seem to be just that, tales and legends. But then, as fate would have it, I found a story that had me wondering if it could be possible. The more I researched, I knew I had to check it out. What I found was almost unbelievable. Without a doubt, it was the scariest time of my life and something I will never forget. In 2018, I had the opportunity to meet with a family that had quite a story. You see, this one family has owned the same farm in Georgia for nearly 200 years. They explained to me that Richard Gellar, the original owner of the farm, had a secret. This secret has been passed down through many generations. When Jacob Gellar, the great-great-great-grandson of Richard, found a cave on the massive farm that he had heard about his whole life, that's when he got in touch with me. I have heard stories from all over Georgia about giant men who roamed around at night. What Jacob explained to me was they all came from this one place right there on the Gellar farm. One of the most unbelievable tales anyone could imagine was happening right there on this farm. Richard Gellar knew it and covered it up to protect his family. Jacob, armed with the knowledge he had from years of documents and accounts, was able to do what his grandfather and his father had not been able to do. He found the cave that they couldn't find. This farm is massive and deep into the northern part of Georgia. Nearly 2,000 acres in size, and some of it only accessible by ATV. The terrain is a mix of steep hills, pasture, and muddy bogs. He traced the clues Richard had left behind, and after 50 years of searching, he found it. That is where the story takes a dark turn. I met Jacob at the main house. I had already talked to him on the phone about the cave and what he thought was absolute proof of what was happening there. There had been new reports of large figures being seen around the back roads and mountains that surrounded the area. As we began to talk, I noticed his voice cracking and tears coming to his eyes. He was terrified about what he had seen around the cave and had a hard time talking about it. All this time he had heard about the giants from his grandfather. The search was over, and now all he could do was try to figure out how to cover it up. He explained that he had seen bones of animals and even human skeletons. Jacob talked about how he found skulls and even heard voices from the cave that he searched for all his life. It terrified him to think that his family had covered this up. Now, he was the one that had to deal with it. We set out for the northernmost point of the farm. I was nervous and near paranoid. This was a huge deal for the entire world to know, and I had no idea what I was getting into. We had to park the ATV about 300 or so yards away from the cave. The terrain was just too rough to go any further. We hiked in the rest of the way, and I was feeling uneasy already. An overwhelming feeling of being watched washed over me. Jacob said that this is where he had heard the faint voice in the distance, so we paid close attention to what we were hearing. I smelled something out of the ordinary, and Jacob even asked me about it. "Do you smell that? What could possibly be making that smell?" Jacob asked me for a second time. And this odor was becoming stronger. He said that we were only about 100 yards away from the cave, and we were nearly sick to our stomachs in anticipation. This odor smelled like rotting meat. It was so strong I threw up and was not feeling well at all. I heard Jacob retching near me as well. This was not good. We were already scared to death and now sick as could be. We covered our mouths and noses the best we could with handkerchiefs, which seemed to help. We topped the small hill where we could finally see the entrance to the cave. No wonder it took so long to find. It was hidden extremely well. Several large trees were shaped and bent in front of it to cover it up and conceal the entrance. The rotting meat odor was still there, but we must be getting used to it as we were no longer getting sick from it. Suddenly, Jacob and I heard a deep growling noise coming from the direction of the cave. "You hear that?" Jacob said. "Oh my God. What have we gotten into?" I could not believe what we were hearing. The closer we got, the more scared we became. I was not prepared for what happened next. We were as prepared as we could possibly be with flashlights, guns, and essential items we could think of. It took nearly 2 hours to get there from the main house. There was no cell phone reception, and we didn't have any way to communicate outside of walkie-talkies we both carried. This cave looked like it had been chiseled out of solid stone. I noticed a large bone on the outside of the cave. I am no expert at all, but it looked to be a femur. I was terrified beyond measure. This is unreal. Jacob and I were trembling in fear. As we got closer to the entrance of the cave, we heard a moaning voice. It sounds like a person. Jacob said, "Yeah, it was definitely human." Another moan, then a guttural growl. We got to the entrance of the cave and saw what looked like a large, hairy man. He must have been at least 10 feet tall. Long, stringy brown hair covered his body and head. We could barely see his face, but when he turned his head to the side, we saw a definite huge flat nose and large almond-shaped eyes with deep eye sockets. It was breathing heavily with drool dripping from its mouth. It was covered in mud and leaves and had long fingers with claw like nails that curved inward. Dried blood covered his hairy thighs, and he appeared to be incredibly strong and muscular. I could not fathom the enormous size of this man. He had to be 800 or maybe even 1,000 pounds. Frozen in fear, I had no idea what to do. This was just unthinkable to see. There was a huge giant of a man directly in front of me and Jacob, and we were both in awe. He locked eyes with us and let out a huge roar. It shook the cave and dust filled the air. Small branches and acorns fell from the trees. As Jacob and I backed away from the cave, we noticed in the corner a woman shivering and crying for help. Jacob quickly reached for her and gently grabbed her arm. The giant grunted and moved towards us threateningly. I threw a large rock at him, hitting him in the middle of the chest. All three of us got out of the cave, and we ran as quickly as we could towards the ATV. The giant was not finished at all. He reached out with his huge long arms and grabbed my backpack and threw me to the ground. "Jacob! Jacob!" I screamed as loud as I could. Jacob turned around and fired one shot with his gun, hitting the giant in the shoulder. It turned and took off, leaving me on the ground where he threw me. Jacob got me to my feet. Jacob, the girl, and I got on the ATV and drove away. This was unreal. I have to be in a dream. Is this really happening? We made it back to the Gellar house and calmed down as best we could. We found out that the woman in the cave was from 50 or so miles away. She said she was abducted from her local park by this huge man while she was walking. She had seen several other men and women in the cave. Sadly, she was the only one that made it out alive. We called the police and told them our story. They came and did an entire investigation of the cave. The giant was gone. The cave was still full of bones, clothing, and personal items of people from all over the area. They found fresh blood and a lot of it near the entrance, but no giant. Jacob and I are still in shock over what happened. The police are still investigating, but trying to explain what we went through was nearly impossible. It has been more than a year, and we are still no closer to solving the disappearance of the giant or giants. I wake up at night in total fear. Jacob and I both are terrified of the smallest things, and it is hard to get through the day. Somehow, we will get through this. Somehow this story will help someone else. Until then, be careful what you want to find. It may not turn out to be what you expect. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please consider liking and sharing this video. It helps a great deal, especially for new channels. I would love it if you would subscribe. I have a ton of my original stories just like this one that I am going to be uploading soon. Thanks again, and as always, stay spooky.